Hi, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and just give it a quick minute for folks to enter our virtual room here, and we'll get started shortly. Thank you for joining. All right, hi, good morning, everyone. It's about a minute or so in, and we do have quite a few folks in with us today, so we can go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Meta Pollywall with the Orange County Water District, and I'm excited to welcome you to our September webinar. It's tackling groundwater contamination through a collaborative effort. And particularly, we'll be talking about groundwater cleanup efforts in the northern part of the Orange County Groundwater Basin. So before we get started, I wanted to mention that we are in webinar mode, so our attendees are muted to reduce background noise. However, we encourage you to ask questions through the Q&A box that you could see located at the bottom of your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the OCWD website and posted to our YouTube channel. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today. They'll each give their presentation, and then we'll do a Q&A at the end. So Dave Mark is a principal hydrogeologist with the Orange County Water District, where he is responsible for managing the North Basin Groundwater Contamination Project and serving on the Technical Advisory Committee for the Alameda Seawater Intrusion Barrier Project. His extensive experience includes groundwater contamination investigation and remediation, private and municipal groundwater supply, seawater intrusion mitigation, technical support for establishing groundwater rights, and public outreach associated with groundwater remediation projects. Prior to joining OCWD in 2005, he worked in private consulting for more than 20 years. And Miley G is an engineering geologist with the Santa Ana Regional Water Quality Control Board in the site cleanup section. Prior to entering the government sector, where she has served as a professional geologist for 10 years, Miley worked for several years in the environmental consulting industry as a project geologist and project manager. She has managed projects involving the investigation and remediation of contaminated soil vapor, and groundwater resulting from the operations of underground fuel storage tanks, petroleum pipeline and storage facilities, aerospace manufacturing, circuit board manufacturing, metal plating, and dry cleaning facilities. Miley also has experience working on United States EPA Superfund sites located in Southern California. So thank you very much for joining us, Dave and Miley, for our webinar today. I will go ahead and kick it off to Dave, who will share his screen and start the presentation.
Okay. Thanks, Meta. Let me share my screen. And there we go. Hopefully everybody can see that okay. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining. So let me start by showing a map of where we're located. So the orange line on this map is the Orange County line, the Orange County boundary. The blue line is the outline of the Orange County Groundwater Basin. That's what OCWD manages and provides over 75% of the water supply for over 2.5 million people in central and northern Orange County. So very valuable groundwater resource, local resource. So the area where there's contamination I'm going to talk about is in this red rectangle. It's in the northern part of the Orange County Groundwater Basin. There is no formal North Basin. It's just in the northern part of the basin, so we call it North Basin. I'm going to show a generalized, a simplified geologic cross-section going roughly from Anaheim to Huntington Beach. And one of the things I want you to notice is there are three main aquifers or aquifer zones: the shallow, the principal, and the deep. Most of the production that provides, over 75% of the water supply is from this principal aquifer, but there is some in the shallow and the deep aquifer. The other thing I want you to notice is these brown layers are aquitards, silts and clays that separate the aquifers. But if you go to the northeast up towards Anaheim, you'll notice those aquitards, they pinch out. They're no longer present. And as a result, groundwater or any surface water that recharges, rainfall that percolates, will get into all three aquifers in this area. That's why OCWD operates our recharge basins up in Anaheim. But it can be problematic with contamination because you don't have those laterally continuous aquitards. Contamination that works its way down and from the soil and into the groundwater can get into that principal aquifer, which again is a primary drinking water supply. North Basin area where there's contamination is up in this, we call it the forebay, that area where we don't have those laterally continuous aquitards. So what are the contaminants I'm talking about? We refer to them as volatile organic compounds or VOCs. These are synthetic degreasing solvents. These are man-made liquids that are really effective at taking oil and grease off of stuff. If you machine a metal part, you've got to get the cutting oils off. Before you paint or plate metal, you want to get any oil and grease off so that the paint sticks. Before you etch a circuit board, you would degrease those circuit boards. So these things are very effective at doing that. They're chlorinated ethenes and ethanes. An ethene is two carbons with a double bond, and ethane, two carbons with a single bond. Common degreasing solvents, tetrachloroethylene, also called perchloroethylene or PCE. In fact, PCE was very commonly used for dry cleaning. They would use PCE up till the very end of last year. It's been outlawed and they've replaced it with a different solvent. Trichloroethylene, TCE, another common solvent. In fact, the diagram to the right, you can see the three chlorines instead of the hydrogen. That's the trichloroethylene. Another solvent used, 1,1-trichloroethane. Another common solvent that was used, although it readily alters to 1,1-dichloroethylene or 1,1-DCE. So to prevent that, a stabilizer was added called 1,4-dioxane. And in fact, in groundwater, in the environment, usually you don't even see 1,1-TCA or very little. What you mainly see is 1,1-DCE and 1,4-dioxane. Both have, possible health issues, why they're considered contaminants. They were widely used in the US from the 1950s, the late 50s to the early 1990s. They were very inexpensive and again, very effective. They're volatile, which means they readily evaporate. So not only do we have groundwater issues, but if you've got these VOCs, these solvents in the soil under a building, it could cause a problem with indoor air, vapor intrusion, it's called. Something the Regional Water Quality Control Board, MILey, and others, DTSC, Department of Toxic Control, and EPA are addressing, and not so much OCWD. We're focused on the groundwater. They're also heavier than water. So as they work their way down to the soil, they hit the water table, they'll continue to keep going downward. As opposed to, say, gasoline or diesel are lighter or less dense than water, they'll hit the water table and kind of float there in the groundwater, not these degreasing solvents. And they have low part per billion drinking water standards. The drinking water standard for PC and TC is 5 parts per billion. The drinking water standard for 1,1-DCE is 6 parts per billion. 1,4-dioxane doesn't have a maximum contaminant level yet. It has what's called a state notification level, which means if it's in water from a well and a producer wants to provide that water and it's above 1 part per billion, that's the notification level, they have to give notification to their customers, which obviously they don't want to do. So how do these VOCs get into the groundwater? Leaky underground storage tanks, or the piping from the storage tank to where the solvent was being used, sumps, in the floor, maybe a concrete lined sump or a steel sump. The steel will rust. Concrete is porous. So, there would maybe a sump in the floor of a manufacturing building. They filled it with solvents, dipped the parts in the solvent. The solvents went right through the concrete, got into the soil, and eventually groundwater. Leaky equipment, a long-term leak can work its way down, spills in chemical storage areas. And in North Basin, I'm aware of one site where there was illegal waste dumping, where to save money on getting rid of the spent solvents, the manufacturer just took a backhoe, dug a pit out back, and dumped it in the ground. That, again, has been very rare, but it does happen. It's about 200 feet from the ground surface to the water table. So these contaminants have worked their way all the way down. So this is our most recent VOC plume map, 2019 plume map. And let me explain the colors. The solid colors are contaminants in the shallow aquifer. The crosshatch are in the principal. Again, in this area, there's obviously hydraulic connection. You can see the contaminants are in both. So the solid blue, for example, are VOCs above drinking water standards to 5 times those drinking water standards, the MCLs or NL's notification level. The green is 5 to 10 times, yellow 10 to 20 and so forth. So the crosshatch in the principal, the blue crosshatch is greater than drinking water standards up to 5 times, and then the green is 5 to 10 times. So you can see we've got widespread contamination. These red bullseyes are production wells that have been knocked out, taken out of service, and destroyed due to VOC contamination. To date, 5 production wells have been taken out of service, 3 owned by the city of Fullerton, 1 owned by the city of Anaheim, and then a privately owned well that used to be used to manufacture soda and bottled water. Notice the scale of the map. Okay, that's a mile. This plume is about 5.5 miles long. It's about 1.5 miles wide. And near the leading edge, it's over 450 feet deep. So this is a pretty big, large plume and poses, again, a serious threat to our drinking water. Groundwater flow directions in the shallow aquifer, predominantly to the west, some to the southwest. Those are the solid blue arrows. The crosshatch arrows are groundwater flow directions in the principal aquifer, which is mainly to the southwest. So this map shows the plume outline of our 2013 plume map versus our 2019 plume map. And as you can see, the plume is getting bigger, it's expanding. And in fact, most of the expansion is in the principal aquifer, which is a concern. And let me talk about that. I'm going to show you some graphs of monitoring wells in the principal aquifer here and here, showing VOC concentrations. So this is at this location here, OCWD monitoring well FM19C. And the bottom of the shallow top of the principal is roughly about 200 feet. This well is screened 365 to 385 feet below the ground surface, clearly in the principal aquifer. And you can see the PCE concentration steadily going up. Drinking water standards down here. So clearly that's a problem. If a plume is stable, the concentration of the contaminant will either be steady or they'll be going down. If it's going up, that means your plume is not stable. Let me show you a monitoring well over here, also in the principal aquifer, well into the principal aquifer. Another OCW monitoring well AM30. This is TCE, a different VOC, a different contaminant. And again, it shows a steady increase in VOC concentration. So clearly, the plume is not stable. It's getting worse and something needs to be done. Well, this is a challenge. There are multiple sources. These are commingled plume. It's not just from one site, multiple sites. And as I mentioned, the plume is very large, it's very deep, and there's a lot of heterogeneity in the aquifer. This is not layer cake hydrogeology. Things change over very short distances and makes it a challenge. And because of that, the only practical approach to remediation is plume containment using extraction wells. That's one part of the puzzle. The other part, very important, is removing the continuing sources of groundwater contamination. So where the releases occurred, you got to knock the sources out. Otherwise, you'll be running those plume containment extraction wells forever. So OCWD has attempted to address the problem. We've installed over 100 monitoring wells to evaluate the extent of the plume. These pink bullseyes are where we've installed monitoring wells. Most of them have 2, 3, a few even have 4 wells right next to each other to not only characterize the lateral extent of contamination, but also the vertical extent. The blue circles are what we call West Bay multi-port wells. That's a deep well with multiple screen intervals, but each screen interval is sealed off so we can collect a depth discrete sample from those wells. So we've done quite a bit of work out there to characterize the plume. And we started to implement a project, the plume containment project. We called it the North Basin Groundwater Protection Project. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, just briefly. And then we also filed a lawsuit in state superior court against some of the companies responsible for the contamination to help pay for the remediation. And I'll talk about that briefly in a bit as well. So let me talk about our old North Basin Groundwater Protection Project. Our approach was to install, at least initially, 6 extraction wells. We were going to target containing 5 to 10 times the MCL or notification level. And then we would operate and monitor, and if we needed to add more wells, we would, make sure we're protecting the groundwater resources. Those 6 wells were installed. The treatment plant, we had a single centralized treatment plant. It was 90% designed. We were going to use injection wells to inject that treated water back into the aquifer. That was about 90% designed. We had completely designed the pipelines to take the contaminated groundwater from the extraction wells to the treatment plant, and then the treated water from the treatment plant to the injection wells. That was designed, and we were moving ahead with this project. And then we got a very unfavorable ruling in state court. Pretty much the court ruled against us. And so our board of directors put the project on hold, except for one extraction well, and I'll talk about that in a bit. So the project was put on hold, and our board of directors said to us staff, see if you can find another alternative besides state superior court to get those companies responsible for contamination to pay for it. Otherwise, everybody's water bills are going to go up to pay for it, and we're going to remove millions of dollars from the local economy. So that's what we set out to do. But let me talk about what happened in state court. It was a bench trial. That's where the judge decides the outcome. There was no jury. And the bottom line is the judge believed the defendant's experts and not OCWD's experts. In fact, the defendant's experts, they convinced the judge the plume was just going to dissipate, it was going to attenuate on its own, and nothing needed to be done. I've shown you 2 time series plots, 2 graphs that show, no, that's not happening. And I could show you more. And on top of that, 9 months after the judge issued the final ruling, the city of Fullerton lost another production well due to the VOC contamination. So clearly the so-called experts of the defendants got it wrong, but because they convinced the judge ended up getting it wrong. All right, enough of that, water under the bridge. So what did we do to move ahead? We solicited help from EPA. And EPA agreed. They said, yeah, we recognize this is a very important local groundwater resource, especially these days with extended droughts. And they agreed to help. They also recognize here's an opportunity to maybe prevent another San Gabriel Valley or San Fernando Valley, those not familiar with those areas. Deep regional VOC plumes. It's so deep that all you can do is put treatment plant on each production well, which is very inefficient because you're treating huge volumes of water. So we can do something and get most of the contamination before that happens. It would be beneficial. And then OCWD, we agreed to conduct what's called a remedial investigation and feasibility study for an interim remedy to address areas with high concentrations of VOCs. And I'll talk about that interim remedy in a bit. So basically, we're going back to the drawing board. We're going to do some more field work to help characterize the plume. That's remedial investigation and a feasibility study, look at new alternatives to address the plume. And then EPA is agreed to serve as the lead agency, even though it wasn't a Superfund site. EPA said, well, okay, we'll serve as a lead oversight agency with additional oversight by the state. The Santa Ana Regional Water Quality Control Board, where Miley works, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, DTSC. And then we were successful in getting a Proposition 1 grant to help pay for not quite half, but almost half of the cost to do that RIFS. And so we have State Water Resources Control Board, the Prop 1 grant folks also involved in providing review and oversight. So while we started out on this RIFS for the interim remedy, EPA proposed listing the North Basin area as a Superfund site, an NPL site. So National Priority List or NPL, Superfund site, same thing. So that was proposed for listing in January of 2018. And then the site was placed on the NPL, became a formal Superfund site September 3rd of last year. So what are the benefits of that? EPA gets federal authority under the Superfund laws, CERCLA and SARA. And the main thing is the responsible parties could be held liable for paying for the remediation costs. They can do that in an agreement, a consent agreement with EPA. If they kind of are not cooperative, EPA can issue an order. If they still say no, EPA can implement the remedy using federal Superfund money, and then they can recover up to 3 times the cleanup costs. So EPA has a pretty good hammer to get those responsible to pay for the cleanup. And by the way, EPA offered those companies responsible for contamination, at least some of them, the opportunity for what's called a Superfund alternative approach, but were turned down. So the Superfund alternative approach is the parties agree they will, step up to the plate and take on the remediation without having to place the site on the NPL or make it a Superfund site. They turned it down, so EPA moved ahead and listed the site. So this is an EPA diagram explaining kind of the whole Superfund process. Starting step 1, that's preliminary assessment and site inspection. That's kind of records review of a site. Site inspection, maybe some limited sampling just to get a feel for how bad the site might be. Then they go through a process of putting a site on the national priority list, making it a Superfund site. And then you would start the remedial investigation. That's detailed field work to help characterize the extent of contamination. Then you do a feasibility study where you look at different alternatives to remediate the site. There's no recommendation in the feasibility study. It's these are the alternatives and we've evaluated them. The recommendation is in a separate document called the proposed plan. EPA issues that. That goes out for public review. There's also a public meeting. And then EPA makes a final decision. That's the record of decision, the ROD. And then after that, you can start implementing with your remedial design and remedial action. And then with groundwater, you're going to have some long-term operation and maintenance costs. Well, OCWD started the RIFS while EPA was going through this whole PASI and an NPL listing process. That saved about 2 to 3 years to getting to implementation of the interim remedy. And so it's been a unique agreement between OCWD and EPA. So let me talk about that interim remedy. So this red polygon, there we go. The red polygon is what we call the interim remedy containment area. And the objective of the interim remedy is to contain groundwater contamination above drinking water standards within that polygon. Now, you'll notice there's still a lot of plume outside of it. That's going to be addressed later. Most of the areas with the higher concentrations are within this interim remedy. So we want to get going with that as soon as possible. We don't want to wait what could take many years just to characterize this part of the plume. Let's get started in areas we know is bad and get an interim remedy going right now. So again, I mentioned we were doing an RIFS for the interim remedy. The RI part of that, remedial investigation, includes installing some monitoring wells. We installed even more monitoring wells to help characterize the plume. As part of the RI, we installed 23 monitoring wells at 13 locations. So again, some of the locations have wells at different depths. Some of the locations we may have installed a monitoring well adjacent to an existing well where the deepest well was contaminated. We went even deeper to get the bottom of the contamination. So the larger magenta or pink bullseyes are where we installed additional wells specifically as part of the RI. We also developed a groundwater model. The model will help us model groundwater containment scenarios. Here's the outline of the model boundaries you can see, as well as the grid, and you can see the interim remedy containment areas well within that. That way your model boundaries don't affect calculations done within the area of containment. And then we are currently preparing a human health risk assessment and an RI report. So the risk assessment calculates what kind of health risks are being posed by the groundwater contamination. So if somebody were to drink the water in the plume, what kind of risks would be posed? Now, you know, people live in that plume. Most of them are served by City of Fullerton, City of Anaheim. They have to adhere to very strict drinking water standards. Nobody is drinking highly contaminated water. But there is nothing in place that prevents somebody from putting a well in that area and drinking the water. Somebody lives in that area, wants to put a well in their backyard, they're free to do so. So the risk assessment will address some of those issues. And then the RI report, that's the result of what we found in the RI, updated plume maps, cross sections. In fact, the human health risk assessment will become an appendix to the RI report. We're hoping to have that finalized by the end of the year. We're also working on the feasibility study for this interim remedy. Again, the objective is to contain contamination, groundwater contamination with VOCs above the drinking water standards within that interim remedy area. I mentioned all we can do is groundwater pumping, but we've screened different technologies just to verify that that is correct. Again, the plume is just too big, it's too deep, there's too much heterogeneity in the aquifer to look at doing something in situ. It's just not practical in this case. So we look at technologies, we screen out those that won't work, retain those to do, come up with alternatives, and then we evaluate those alternatives. In the FS, we evaluate the alternatives for 7 criteria. Some of those criteria include overall protection of human health and the environment. In other words, are we protecting our groundwater resources? Are we preventing people from being exposed to groundwater contamination? Implementability is another one of the 7. What you're proposing on doing in your alternative, is it available? Is it proven? Is it off the shelf? Is it reliable? And then cost is one of the 7. Capital cost, the cost to construct your remedy, your operation and maintenance cost to run it, and then the cost to operate and maintain as well as construct it for 30 years. That's what we refer to as a net present value 30-year cost. So let me talk about the alternatives that are going to be in our FS. 3 main alternatives. One is the no action if you do nothing. That's required by the National Contingency Plan, the NCP. Those are the federal regulations of how you address a Superfund site. So your FS needs to include a no action. Clearly that won't meet our objectives. I've shown you how the plume's getting worse, but it's in the FS, it'll be in the FS. Monitor natural attenuation. That's just letting the plume dissipate on its own, but you monitor to see if that in fact is working. That'll be part of alternative 2 along with institutional controls. So we already know the monitor natural attenuation is not going to cut it. Institutional controls would be putting in place, for example, measures that would prevent somebody from putting a well in within the plume and drinking that water. And then alternative 3 is actual active remediation with groundwater containment using extraction wells, treatment to remove the contaminants, then beneficial use of the treated water. We just can't waste this water. We're not going to dump it to a storm drain and let it go to the ocean. It's just too valuable. But we have 4 sub-alternatives or 4 scenarios with alternative 3. So they all include extraction wells. All those 4 different scenarios, alternative 3, have extraction wells. And our modeling indicated you might need 17 extraction wells pumping about 7,800 gallons a minute. That's 11 million gallons a day. We would, what could happen, since we won't be implementing, is 5 of 6 existing extraction wells could be used, plus 12 new wells. So these are the various scenarios of alternative 3. It gets down to what happens with the water extracted by those containment extraction wells. So A is the water is discharged to the sewer. It gets treated through OC San, that's Orange County Sanitation District. They now go by OC San. And then from there, their secondary effluent comes to OCWD's Groundwater Replenishment System, our GWRS, and then we recharge that water back into the aquifer. For those who aren't familiar with OCW's GWRS, I recommend you go on our website and learning more about it. It's the largest system of its kind in the world. I don't have time to go into more detail. So let me get back to our different scenarios. Alternative 3, treatment plant, a centralized treatment plant, and then discharge to the city of Fullerton's potable water distribution system. There are added hurdles to that, but that is an alternative. C would be a treatment plant and then recharge the treated water with injection wells. And then D would be the treatment plant and then recharge using a new recharge basin. So those are those 4 scenarios. This is a draft of the hypothetical alternative 3C. Nothing's been finalized yet in our FS, but this is what we're working on now. This shows the red dots would be new extraction wells. Whoops, sorry. The blue are existing extraction wells that OCWD installed. There'd be pipelines to take it to a centralized treatment plant, and then a line of injection wells to inject the water outside of the plume in the shallow aquifer. You don't want to inject in the middle of a plume, or you just spread the plume out. That's why we're going south of the plume. We could inject below the plume in the principal aquifer and not go as far south, but the total dissolved solids of the shallow aquifer groundwater is much higher than the principal aquifer, and there are state anti-degradation requirements. So for us to do that, or anybody to do that, you'd have to put expensive reverse osmosis treatment on about half of that water. Much cheaper to go south and inject outside of the plume in the shallow. I mentioned one of the extraction wells we did put in operation. That's EW1 over where this arrow is, this blue circle. The plume in this area is diving down quickly. It was threatening a couple City of Fullerton production wells. We just couldn't wait for this whole RAFS process to take years. And so we started operating that well with the help of another Proposition 1 grant. So that as we speak, that well's pumping 800 to 1,000 gallons a minute. The water's going to the sewer, to then OC San, and then OCWD's GWRS, where the treated water ends up back in the aquifer. Just to give you an indication, these are again preliminary. These numbers very well could change between now and when we finalize our feasibility study. Just a range from the lowest cost alternative is the pump, treat, and then recharge using injection wells, a 30-year cost of $180 million. The highest cost is actually to pump and discharge to the sewer, OC San, and then GWRS. Why? Because OC San charges a little over $1,000 an acre foot to put the water in the sewer, to take the water and treat it. And then we have OCWD's GWRS operating cost of about $700 an acre foot. So that makes that option the most expensive. So in terms of selecting the remedy, EPA will be the one that proposes, I mentioned that proposed plan. What they're going to propose is going to be general. It's not going to say we propose alternative 3C. It's just going to say maybe alternative 3 and these components of alternative 2. It's going to be very general to allow a lot of flexibility in what eventually gets designed and implemented. So maybe the final remedy is a mixture of some of those different options. Again, I mentioned the proposed plan goes out for public review, and there's a public meeting. Then EPA will make that final decision. They'll issue a record of decision. And implementation is going to be done by the parties responsible for the contamination, not OCWD. At that point, we're going to step back. And again, that was the goal of getting the responsible parties to pay for remediation and not our ratepayers. So EPA is currently working on 3 major activities. They're providing oversight, our interim remedy RAFS, reviewing our deliverables. They are currently identifying the parties responsible for contamination. They call them potentially responsible parties, or PRPs. That's all confidential. We're not privy to any of that work. We hear the list of PRPs that's coming out soon. I don't know what soon means, but EPA is working on that. And then EPA has started working on what they refer to as a comprehensive RI to characterize the plume outside the interim remedy. Ultimately, there needs to be a decision if additional remedial action needs to be done to supplement the interim remedy. So at these locations, these 5 locations, these orange dots, EPA is installing monitoring wells. They are out there as we speak. Here's a picture of one of the drill rig they're using. So they're installing 19 monitoring wells at 5 locations. So some of the locations have 3 wells at different depths. I think one location has 5 wells at different depths. If EPA gets additional funding, they'll install more wells. And you can see, you know, this is outside the interim remedy containment area. This is, again, the start of characterizing and determining what needs to be done to address the rest of the plume. Ultimately, there'll probably be a whole nother RIFS for the rest of the plume, or actually the whole plume in its entirety. That's why EPA refers to it as a comprehensive RI. That'll probably get taken over by the responsible party, the PRPs. So again, there are 2 key components to the remediation, this big, large plume. One is plume containment, what I just talked about. And the other, very important, is eliminating the sources of contamination. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Miley to talk about things the regional board is doing along those lines. So I will stop sharing.
Thanks, Dave. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Dave. Today, I'm going to be providing an overview of the California water boards, who we are, and what we do to protect water quality throughout the state and within the North Basin area. The State Water Resources Control Board is one of 6 Cal EPA departments and agencies charged with enforcing environmental regulations in California. The other 5 agencies shown here include the California Air Resources Board, the Cal Recycle, Department of Pesticide Regulation, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, or DTSC, and OEHA, also known as the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. In 1949, the California legislature enacted the Leaky Water Pollution Act, which created a state water pollution control board and established 9 regional water pollution control boards located in each of the major California watersheds, in recognition that California's water pollution problems are regional and vary based on precipitation, topography, population, and local land uses. The regional boards were created to oversee and enforce the state's pollution abatement program. The State Water Pollution Control Board was later renamed the State Water Quality Control Board, and in 1967, the State Water Resources Control Board was created by the legislature, taking over the functions of the State Water Quality Control Board and the State Water Rights Board. The joint authority of water allocation and water quality protection enables the Water Board to provide comprehensive protection for California's waters. The Porter Cologne Water Quality Control Act was passed in 1969 and was so influential that some sections of Porter Cologne were used as the basis of the Federal Water Pollution Control Act amendments of 1972, also known as the Clean Water Act. So this is a general overview of the organization of the State Water Board, which has 5 primary divisions, including the Division of Water Quality, the Division of Financial Assistance, the Division of Water Rights, and the Division of Drinking Water, and also a Division of Administrative Services. The State Water Board consists of 5 full-time salaried members each filling a different specialty position. Each board member is appointed to a 4-year term by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. As mentioned in the previous slide, there are also 9 regional water quality control boards or regional boards. The specific responsibilities and procedures of the regional boards and the State Water Board are outlined in the Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act, Division 7 of the California Water Code. The general responsibilities of the State Water Board include developing statewide policy and regulations for water quality and allocating water rights. The regional boards are responsible for local implementation, including developing basin plans for their hydraulic areas, issuing waste discharge requirements and authorizations, and taking enforcement actions against violators. This slide shows the location and areas of the 9 regional boards. Each regional board has 7 part-time members that are appointed by the governor and confirmed by the Senate. The Santa Ana region continues to be one of the most rapidly growing areas of the state. While the region is geographically the smallest, it covers the most populated areas of Orange, Riverside, and San Bernardino counties. The Santa Ana River is the region's main surface water body and is responsible for approximately 35% of the recharge into the Orange County Groundwater Basin. Extensive groundwater basins underlie much of the region, but local recharge provides only a fraction of the area's water needs, which are primarily met by imported water. The Santa Ana Regional Board's office is located in Riverside. At the Santa Ana Regional Board, our mission is to preserve, enhance, and restore the quality of California's water resources and ensure their proper allocation and efficient use for the benefit of present and future generations. The Santa Ana region covers approximately 2,800 square miles of land. It has 460 miles of streams, over 21,000 acres of lakes, and 24 miles of coastline. The Santa Ana Regional Board has 3 major divisions, including the Surface Water Regulatory Division, the Regional Planning Division, and the Groundwater Protection Division. The Groundwater Protection Division includes the Site Cleanup Program, which I work for, underground storage tanks, landfill and DOD projects, and special projects and enforcement. Under the authority of Division 7 of the California Water Code, the State Water Board and the regional boards have broad authority to require investigation and cleanup of sites with unauthorized pollutant releases. The sections of the California Water Code shown here on this slide are the sections that are applied most frequently to our site cleanup program cases. The primary goal of the site cleanup program is to direct and provide oversight of site investigation and cleanup activities that will result in restoration and protection of water quality, human health, and the environment. Many of our cases are former industrial sites that may have old spills or leaks. We also have smaller cases such as dry cleaning facilities that may have had spills during their operations. Site cleanup staff also partners with staff from other agencies to address regional groundwater contamination plumes. An example of this is the work we are doing in the Orange County North Basin. The investigation and remediation work that we oversee is generally carried out by responsible parties under voluntary cleanup agreements, but we also issue investigation orders, and if necessary, we issue enforcement orders, such as cleanup and abatement orders under Section 13304 of Division 7 of the California Water Code. And so this map shows a snapshot of our active site cleanup cases in the Santa Ana region. Additional information and environmental data for our site cleanup cases are available on our online database known as GeoTracker. The link to GeoTracker is provided at the bottom of this page here. And I've also circled in the purple oval the approximate location of our North Basin site cleanup cases. And so there are at least 18 active source sites that are being overseen by the regional board and the Department of Toxic Substances Control, or DTSC, within this North Basin area. The regional board has several cases undergoing active investigation of soil vapor, indoor air, and groundwater to determine the extent of contamination at each individual source site. Other cases are in various phases of soil and groundwater remediation, including conducting remediation pilot tests, operating soil vapor extraction systems, or operating groundwater treatment systems. And this diagram shows the various agencies that are coordinating together to address contaminated groundwater in the North Basin. Some examples of how our region's site cleanup staff are coordinating with other agencies include assisting the Division of Financial Assistance, or DFA, with technical reviews for their grant projects, including the interim RIFS and EW1 projects, which Dave discussed earlier. And it may also include site cleanup sub-account program grants for the remediation of surface or groundwater contamination. We also coordinate with OEHA to evaluate human health risk assessments for our cleanup cases. And we will coordinate with DTSC to determine which agency will act as the lead for new cases in the area. We also coordinate with local municipalities and other interested parties through public participation efforts for our site investigation and remediation work. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, let me go back to mine. Just another slide with some online resources for North Basin. OCWD has a website. It's on general OCWD's website. If you click on what we do, water quality, groundwater cleanup, North Basin, you'll get to some information there, including our latest plume map. EPA has a North Basin website. Here's the link. You probably just do a search on EPA, Orange County North Basin Superfund site, something like that. Miley already mentioned GeoTracker. And then DTSC, for the sites that they oversee, they use something called EnviroStore. So you probably can pull up a map and focus in on their sites in the North Basin area. And that was it. I think with that, I'll turn it back over to Medif and for some questions and answers.
Great.
Stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Dave and Miley. Really appreciate it. And thanks again, Dave, for pulling that last slide on the web links and additional resources. We did get a few questions asking if slides would be available. And so we do generally make that a part of our process. And so our attendees will be able to have access to that information after the fact as well. So thank you for including that in your slide. And as a reminder for our attendees, you could type your questions in the Q&A box. We've seen some come through during the presentation, so we'll go ahead and get started. However, if we're not able to address your question in the time allotted, we can most certainly coordinate with you after the webinar and coordinate responses with our speakers. You can also always email us if you think of something after the fact. You can email your questions to info@ocwd.com and we'll make sure to get in touch with you. And our speakers for today, thank you, Miley and Dave, have agreed to stay on for a few minutes past the hour as well to make sure we can get through as many questions as possible. So thanks for doing that, and we'll go ahead and get started. Dave, I think the question for you, and just to offer some clarification, when you were asking about the who brought the challenge in the unfavorable ruling, was it the parties accused of the contamination?
So OCWD filed a lawsuit against some of the parties responsible for contamination, and then the judge basically ruled against us, ruled in their favor and not in OCWD's favor. So basically the judge, like I say, didn't believe our experts that the plume needed to be cleaned up and didn't believe evidence presented that all these different release sites are responsible for this big, long plume, and let just about everybody off the hook and ruled against us. So it was unfortunate. You know, the judge is not a hydrogeologist or an engineer. And, you know, I guess their experts were more persuasive than ours, but, you know, you'd think you'd consider the fact that our goal is not to make money. Our goal is to protect the groundwater resource, but that's the way it turned out.
Thank you, Dave. And possibly a question for both Dave and Miley. Are you familiar or aware of the water contamination remediation efforts that have been going on in the Naval Weapons Station in Seal Beach?
Miley, you want to go first? Miley, you're muted.
Okay, sorry about that. That's not a project that I'm working on personally. However, if you were to go onto GeoTracker and look it up, I'm sure that you would be able to see the work that's being done there for that case.
Right. And then we are also keeping tabs of what's going on at the Naval Weapons Station. Not me personally, but someone else in my department, hydrogeology department, kind of keeps tabs on what's going on. We have activities going on right near there to deal with seawater intrusion. We've installed a number of monitoring wells on the Naval Weapons Station, not to address their contamination, but to deal with seawater intrusion. So we do interact with the technical folks at the Naval Weapons Station quite a bit.
Great, thank you both. What kind of fines or punishment will these polluters face as a result of their actions?
You know, I can't speak to that. That's enforcement would be by EPA or regional board. Miley, maybe you could speak to that if they don't follow a cleanup and abatement order or something.
Right. We, in terms of what the regional board does, yes, we do have the means to issue fines and penalties through our enforcement orders. And I can't really go back to my slides, but that would be under our administrative enforcement and civil liability section 13268 rather.
Great, thank you. And can these folks be held accountable if the contamination makes people sick is a question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, ultimately they can. I mean, that's not something OCWD would get involved with. But I know EPA, when a site gets listed as a Superfund site, they actually automatically task it's a federal agency for Toxic Substances Disease Registry, something like that, ATSDR, and they do a public health assessment where they actually go into the area that's Superfund site and look for health problems that may be associated with the contamination. And that work is ongoing. Again, OCW is not part of that, but I do know that EPA with assistance from ATSDR does look at that. And then from there, I think if somebody could prove that they do have an illness related to contamination, they'd probably have to file their own civil lawsuit. But boy, I don't really know. I'm talking out of school.
Dave, if you have the information for this particular question, who financed the rebuttal to the OCWD and EPA regarding the legality of cleanup remedies?
Well, all the parties that we, in terms of, I assume you're talking about, well, number one, our litigation, the defendants, they had to hire consultants, but because of the unfavorable ruling, OCWD has had to pay their legal costs, including their experts. So ultimately, by losing that federal lawsuit, OCWD had to pay for a lot of that work, which again is unfortunate. In terms of EPA, they have the ability to seek cost recovery for their costs, past costs, just on their own through the Circle and Sarah law. So it gives them a lot of authority legally to recover that, which is a big advantage for them, something we didn't have.
And one question, why inject into the shallow as opposed to the principal aquifer? Is it to comply with the anti-degradation policy? It's a two-part question.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We could inject the treated water into the principal aquifer, and we looked at that. We looked at it very carefully because it saves on an expensive and long pipeline to get outside of the plume. The problem is the TDS is about double. Even the blended TDS is about double what's in the principal aquifer. So because of anti-degradation requirements, we'd have to add reverse osmosis treatment to about half of the water to be able to inject it into the principal without triggering, anti-degradation requirements. So that's why we're injecting outside of the plume and in the shallow, because of that anti-deg requirement.
Thank you, Dave. What are the sources of the continuing rising levels of contamination?
Well, there are multiple sources out there, and they still need to be remediated. That's something the regional board is actively doing, is getting the sites to, cleaned up. It's not easy. Miley will attest that, it's expensive, and property owners or tenants, they don't want to do it, don't want to spend the money. Some may or may not have insurance to help cover that. So there's a lot of pushback, and it's always a battle, and Miley knows it. She's on the forefront of that, but there are sites that are still continuing sources, need to be cleaned up. I'm sure there are sites that haven't even been identified yet that are sources of contamination that hopefully in time will get identified and cleaned up. Miley, I don't know if anything else you want to add to that.
I was just going to mention that there are definitely, sites out there that we aren't aware of that can be contributing to the increase in contamination. And that's just a long process. And EPA, I think, like Dave mentioned earlier, is going through that process of identifying PRPs at this point.
Great. And Dave, you did talk about the cities that are included in the North Basin area. Is Fountain Valley, are Fountain Valley wells included within that parameter? Okay.
Yeah, not at all. It's pretty far from Fountain Valley. The cities that are affected, Fullerton, most of the plumes in Fullerton, some and in Anaheim, not as much as Fullerton, but a good chunk in Anaheim, and then just a little bit of it is in Placentia as well.
Great, thank you for that clarification. Next question, based on some of the VOC time plots shown, it would appear that plume migration has increased relatively recently since the plume release. Have specific activities been identified that may be causing plume migration in the North Basin?
I don't know about specific activities. I mean, what happens is when a plume starts to arrive, you often get a fairly steep arrival curve. We call it a breakthrough curve. So I think that's what you're seeing. And some of those aren't, I mean, it's taken years. Some of those graphs that I showed were over quite a long period of time. So no, I don't know if there's any activities that would be accelerating. It's just normal operation. I mean, we do recharge water up, and not too far from there in our recharge basins. We need to do that to maintain the local water supply. And then you get seasonal variations. Water tables go up and down, times they go up. You could dissolve more contaminants still up in the soil and they drop. You might have a little bit of a drop off. And then some of it's just plumes arriving from sites that are a little further away from where the monitoring was located.
Great, thank you, Dave. And a question back about the naval weapons, just a little bit more of a direct question. Did you consider bioremediation like the Naval Weapons Station did?
Yeah, we evaluated and it's this plume is just way too big. It's way too deep, and there's a lot of heterogeneity. So the heterogeneity means it's not like a sandbox where it's all the same type of aquifer material. You got interbedded sands and silts and clays and lenses. You know, you might have a clay lens that pinches out, and so to do bioremediation, you have to get amendments to get the bugs to, you know, the bacteria to grow that eats the contaminants. And you have to do a lot of injections. You know, in some places, the Naval Weapons Station, they're injecting stuff every, you know, maybe 50 feet. It's been a long time since I looked at it. You have an injection well injecting amendments, as well as maybe a designed bacteria, they call them bugs, to eat the contaminants. Can you imagine how much you'd have to do in a plume this big and this deep? Not to mention, because of the heterogeneity, you may have a real permeable lens or zone where all your amendments are going to go there. They're not going to get to necessarily where you want them to go. It's going to short circuit. There were attempts out at Hinckley, the site out in the desert where they tried in situ. And again, it was a large plume there. It's chrome. That's the Aaron Brockovich site. They tried in situ out there, and because of similar issues, big plume, deep, a lot of heterogeneity, they just gave up. It just doesn't work. I mean, it's possible, but it would be prohibitively expensive. So it was considered and evaluated and ruled out.
Thank you, Dave.
I might be able to add to that.
Yeah, please, Miley.
I just want to mention that at our source sites, this, you know, in situ remediation is definitely being considered. You know, it really depends on the site specific details. And I just want to, you know, add that it's really difficult in very highly transmissive aquifers, like the principal aquifer and even parts of the shallow aquifer in the North Basin to, you know, to do an injection type remediation on a large scale, just to reiterate what Dave said.
You know, it can work great on a local scale, an individual site, if the contamination is fairly localized, both laterally and vertically, but on a big plume, you know, this big, this deep, with all the heterogeneity, it's just not practical.
Thank you for that detailed response. I appreciate it. A quick kind of two-part question. How again did you determine which industries were responsible and how many industries were involved? I think this is related to the litigation date.
Yeah, so for the litigation, what we did is we looked at Regional Water Quality Control Board and DTSC files where sites had already been identified. And that's where we started to find sources, you know, defend, you know, people to sue for being responsible for contamination. EPA is a whole nother level. They've got consultants, specialists that deal with that, look at all kinds of historical records. And so there'll be a much more comprehensive search. But we started out basically looking at agency files. I think we did a little bit of soil gas sampling. This is before my time at the district. And then installing monitoring wells. You know, all those monitoring wells out there really helps point the finger. If you got, you know, a downgrading contaminated well and upgrading cleaner well, then, you know, somewhere in between is a source, and that helps you target where to look.
Great, thanks, Dave. And then we'll just take two questions here. If the remediation action chosen includes the GWRS, would the treated groundwater be injected into the same groundwater basin that it is being taken from?
Yes, and in this case, I mean, the water coming out of GWRS has been highly purified. We can put it anywhere. It's better than any water quality in the shallow and the principal, you know. So yeah, it would be used. Our GWRS water is used. It's put back into the aquifer. Some of it's used for our seawater intrusion barrier in Fountain Valley, Huntington Beach area. Some of it, we have a handful of injection wells in the Santa Ana area. And then most of the water goes to our recharge basins up in Anaheim, where it ultimately recharges into all the aquifers up there.
Great, thank you, Dave. And what type of groundwater modeling is OCWD performing for the area?
We're doing groundwater flow. We're not doing contaminant transport. And mod flow, which is a public domain model developed by the United States Geological Survey, is being used for that modeling. So it's a finite element model.
Thank you, Dave.
I'm sorry, it's a finite difference model, not a finite element model.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I know we're a few minutes past the hour, and I appreciate Miley and Dave and our attendees for sticking around a few extra minutes. And I do want to note that if we weren't able to get to your question, we will coordinate with Dave and Miley on responses so you do get your questions answered. And of course, if you think of anything after the fact as well, please do not hesitate to email us. And I'll pull up this slide here so you can see the email address you could send to. And just a final reminder that the webinar recording will be posted at our ocwd.com. It will also be on our YouTube channel. And we hope you enjoyed today's webinar. I want to thank Miley and Dave again for their presentations and for answering questions at the end. And I just want to thank all our participants again as well. So we hope you enjoyed it, and have a great day. Thanks, everyone.